Hi, this is Laura, and a big hello to our podcast subscribers. Hi. And if you haven't officially hit the subscribe button yet, please do so at your favorite podcast app. You can also watch the show now on public television. Check your local listings for the day and time, or watch the premiere each week on the World Channel, Sundays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. We're also live on YouTube. The show remains ad-free thanks to you and especially to our Patreon partners. Feeling left out? Join them at patreon.com/The LF Show and become one of our possibility-making partners for as little as $3 a month. You are the wind at our backs. We couldn't do this without you. Thanks. Now, on with this week's show.
Beautiful possibilities that go well beyond what can be achieved by one candidate or one vote. Elections do matter, and the U.S. 2020 elections matter more than most. This week on the Laura Flanders Show, I check in with one of the leading social critics of our time, MIT Professor Emeritus Noam Chomsky. Noam shares how this election was one of the most important elections ever taking place in what he sees as the most dangerous moment in human history. The Laura Flanders Show, the place for the people who say it can't be done, take a back seat for the people who are doing it.
So welcome to the program, Noam. It is wonderful to have you. Let me begin by asking how you're feeling at this moment, meaning what's your take on this election as far as how is it going for the various parties and people?
Well, this is an unusual election. I think in the voting, it's up for grabs, despite what the polls say. But there's another question hanging over it, which has never arisen in 350 years of parliamentary democracy in England, 250 years here. Will the incumbent be willing to leave office if he doesn't like the outcome of the election? He's already said he won't. That's never happened. We're already in uncharted territory. Trump has said, basically, if he doesn't like the way it comes out, he'll declare it to be fraudulent, illegitimate, undocumented immigrants voting, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, there's what is called the Republican Party, which years ago used to be a genuine parliamentary party, but now has just become a gang of people sitting in the president's pocket. And the Republican Party has already began, quite publicly, organizing ways to undermine the electoral results by legalistic maneuvers of a variety of kinds if they don't like the way the outcome came out. So we're in a new situation. This was characterized rather starkly in a very interesting open letter, which I'm sure you saw, which was released by two senior, highly regarded, retired military commanders, John Nagel, Paul Yingling. They released an open letter directed to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, top military officer in the country, reviewing for him his constitutional duties to protect what the Constitution says, to protect the constitutions from enemies, domestic or foreign. Well, they said now there's a domestic enemy, what they called a lawless president, backed by a party of supplicants who are planning to refuse the results of the election if they don't like it, and to surround themselves with armed militias to defend their candidate in the White House. And it is your duty as chairman of the Joint Chiefs to send military forces, maybe they suggested a battalion of the 82nd Airborne, to forcefully remove the militias and escort the president out of office. The very fact that this question is being raised tells us we're in very deep trouble, and it's being considered very seriously.
So should people amongst the populace think their vote doesn't matter if it could be stolen, if there could be what amounts to a coup, if the forces are ranked against them in the way that you describe, why vote?
Nagel and Yinling say there's a coup d'etat in the offing. That's their phrase. The vote does count. The greater the vote against Trump, the harder it will be to pull off these shenanigans. And we certainly don't give up. First of all, we don't know that this is going to happen. Secondly, we can prevent it from happening just by a substantial vote against Trump. Thirdly, even if it does happen, doesn't mean game over. That means you have to turn to other means of protesting the coup d'etat. So I think a lot of options are open, and a lot depends on the sociopathic megalomaniac who's sitting in the White House and the people surrounding him. That's a situation that has never arisen in parliamentary democracies before. It arises in small tin-pot dictatorships where there's a military coup every couple of years, what Trump is trying to turn the United States into. But we don't have to let him do that.
So let's talk about that side of this equation. You have an essay in a book called Turnout, Mobilizing Voters in an Emergency. It's part of a longer collection that you have coming out later this year around universalizing resistance. Turnout isn't something that you've always talked about as much as you do now. You've often talked about sort of permanent power and corporate control. Why is turnout so important to you today? And is it simply a matter of just turning out and casting a vote?
It's always far more important than elections. It's just that it's never been posed as an issue before. It was just, in the traditional left, just taken for granted, understood forever that real politics means constant engagement and activism. That's what makes things happen. Every once in a while, there's an election. You take a couple of minutes off and decide, is there an issue important enough to go push a lever on election day? If there is, you do it, usually voting against somebody. If it isn't, you do something else. Now, in this particular moment, it happens to be of crucial importance because we're in a unique, unusual moment. But the turnout and the pressure is constant, no matter who's president, with one exception, this one. But if it was Richard Nixon, yes, turnout was important. In fact, the big anti-war mobilizations pretty clearly had the effect of preventing Nixon from moving on to vast destruction, maybe even nuclear war in Indochina. The mass protests led Nixon, not the most lovely figure in presidential history, but led him to be the last president to have put through serious liberal protests, legislation. One of them, interestingly, was the leading environmentalist of the Nixon years, Tony Mazzocchi and the Oil, Chemical, Atomic Workers Union. They were the leading environmentalists. They got Nixon to put through environmental legislation, which he wouldn't have done otherwise. The same with OSHA, EPA was Nixon, other things. Ronald Reagan, the huge anti-nuclear demonstrations in the early 80s, biggest mass demonstrations in American history, were instrumental in getting him to move to the agreement with Gorbachev on eliminating intermediate nuclear weapons in Europe, which was a big step forward, dismantled by Trump. No matter who's the president, protests and activism led to have a huge impact.
This year, we've seen one of the largest uprisings and most sort of interconnected movements of our times, the movement around Black lives and calling for a racial reckoning in this country. In the context of the COVID pandemic, those issues of bias and poverty and discrimination and violence and who gets what kind of care have been brought into sharp relief. That being the case, I would think you would be a bit more hopeful or optimistic about this election in this moment.
I would be if it were not for the unprecedented phenomenon of a malignant cancer in the White House. That happens to dominate the scene. Other than that, yes, you'd be right. The mobilizations after the George Floyd murder were without any precedent. Biggest social movement in American history developed very quickly. Now, it didn't just come from nowhere. came from years of organizing and activism. Those are the things you don't see much when they're happening, but they're what lay the basis. We've seen it in many ways. 1619 project of the New York Times, very significant. History of the effect of 400 years of brutal repression of Afro-Americans put on the front pages of the major newspaper. That wouldn't have happened a couple of years earlier. After the assassination of George Floyd, they broke out with enormous popular support. About 2/3 of the population was supporting them. That's way more support than Martin Luther King got at the peak of his popularity. And that shows what regular, steadied activism can produce. Now, if it wasn't for the malignancy, which we have to get rid of, or we're in deep trouble, yes, it would be a very optimistic prospect. We could move forward on many fronts. The same is true, incidentally, even the Biden campaign. The DNC, the Democratic Party management, that's Clintonite, donor-oriented. They don't want any of this stuff. But they've been forced by popular activism to accept reluctantly a party program which is pretty progressive by the standards of the Democratic Party. Very progressive, goes well beyond precedent. Why? Not because of religious conversion, because of the forces that have been mobilized. The Sunrise Movement was involved in preparing the inadequate but significant climate program, labor issues, not too bad by comparative standards, all forced by activism, a lot of it under the Sanders banner, a lot of it independent, been working for years. It's created a situation in which the Democratic Party managers, just like Reagan and Nixon, cannot refrain from offering at least something. And if their feet are held to the fire by continued activism, they'll have to deliver. Not going to be easy. They're not going to do it on their own any more than Lyndon Johnson would have passed the civil rights legislation if it hadn't been for the years of activism of freedom riders, of SNCC workers, young people, blacks refusing to sit at segregated counters. All of that created the background out of which you get legislation. Inadequate, but something moves forward. Then you go on to the next. That's real politics.
This is the Laura Flanders Show. I'm Laura. My guest is social critic and MIT professor emeritus Noam Chomsky. His forthcoming book is Chomsky for Activists, Universalizing Resistance, and it's soon to be released by Routledge. You can watch our pre-election special featuring a part of this conversation where we have our commentators reflect on what Chomsky has to say at our website. That's lauraflanders.org. There you'll find former New York gubernatorial candidate Zephyr Teachout, municipalist movement strategist Makani Temba, and radio host extraordinaire Maria Hinojosa of Latino USA. The special this week launches November 1st on public television stations across the U.S. or on YouTube. For more information on how you can watch where you are, go to lauraflanders.org and sign up for our newsletter. Next, I ask Noam to reflect on a Biden election and to consider whether the Biden administration's approach to the pandemic economy might repeat some of the mistakes of the Obama-Biden administration's approach to the financial crisis. That's coming up. Meanwhile, here's Daydream by Bryony Jarman-Pinto, remixed by Fish Factory Session, released on Tru-Thoughts Records.
Are you afraid that Joe Biden,
one half of the Barack Obama-Biden administration in 2008, coming into power in 2009, will repeat some of the mistakes of that period? Think perhaps that he knows how to deal with a financial crisis and deal with this one the way that administration dealt with that one?
Well, the mistake at that point, in my opinion, was not so much Obama and Biden, who you don't expect anything from. That put to the side. The mistake was not to press them. What happened with Obama is that a lot of people were mesmerized by the pleasant rhetoric and the civilized tones, and they just went home. And that left Obama free to carry out a very vicious scam, which helped lead the way to Trump. You remember what happened with of course you remember, the financial crisis. There was congressional legislation which had two elements. One element was pay off the criminals who created the crisis with predatory lending. So they're responsible, but pay them off. That's one part. The other part was do something for the victims, the people who were thrown out of their homes with foreclosures. The other part of the legislation is give money to them so they can get their homes back. Well, if people stay home and keep quiet, it's not hard to predict which half of the legislation's going to be enacted. And that's what happened. The first part was enacted, pay off the gangsters who created the crisis, don't pay off the victims. That led to tremendous disillusionment for good reasons. It's one reason why you see lots of people who voted for Obama turning and saying, okay, I'll vote for Trump. I can't trust these guys. They're right. They can't trust these guys. And the problem was not pressing constantly to make them do what they were talking about. I don't usually agree with Sarah Palin, but when she was making fun about this hopey, changey stuff, she was right.
What difference does COVID-19 make to this situation in comparison to that one?
Quite a lot. First of all, let's take a look at the bailout. Huge amount, trillions of dollars. Very little of it's gone to the people who need it. It's largely a Wall Street bailout, sort of designed that way. You give discretionary funds to the banks to distribute. Who are they going to distribute it to? Does it take a genius to figure it out? It's a good thing that the CARES legislation went through. It's better than nothing. But it was skewed enormously towards the corporate sector and the rich. The number of billionaires has been going sky high. And so all of that has to be changed. But the main thing about the pandemic is to keep in mind is we will get over it with terrible cost, needless cost. We know that from just taking a look around the world. Vietnam, almost no cases. Senegal, almost no cases. Liberia, New Zealand. Ludicrous to claim that we don't have the capacity of Vietnam and Senegal. Can't seriously argue that. The reactions varied around the world, but the United States is an outlier, has the worst record of any country with the greatest possible resources. And the reason is the malevolence and incompetence in the White House, which is responsible for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths. And it's led to an effort, a desperate effort on the part of the administration to find a scapegoat. You can't say, sorry, I killed tens of thousands of you by not knowing what the heck I was doing. So let's find somebody to blame. China, the World Health Organization, Democratic governors, anybody. And it's hard to overlook how sadistic that is. So take, say, blaming the World Health Organization on ludicrous grounds. Defunding the World Health Organization has consequences. They provide services to poor people in Africa, Yemen, other poor countries who rely on WHO services for survival from all sorts of diseases, malnutrition, and so on. So, okay, let's kill them. Let's kill uncountable numbers of people in order to improve my electoral prospects. I mean, that's the kind of thing we're seeing. And let's harm Americans too. So, for example, there's an international conference, COVAX, which is working on cooperation to develop vaccines. Obviously, the best way to develop them, not warp speed. We'll develop it and monopolize it for ourselves. The best way is cooperation, obviously. They're also working to some extent on distributional problems. how to make sure that the rich don't monopolize the vaccines if they appear, but that they go to the people who need them. Almost everybody's participating, one exception. Trump pulled out. Will harm Americans in order to make it look like I'm a strong man. That means if China gets the vaccine first, as looks pretty likely, incidentally, Americans will be deprived of it because we have to blame China for my malevolence. These are the things that are happening in front of our eyes. Now, what kind of a world is going to emerge from the pandemic when we do finally get over it? That's a battle that's going on right now. Will it be a harsher version of the neoliberal assault that has led to these problems? Or will it be the kind of world in which will restructure itself to work for the benefit of people and their needs and wants rather than the profit of a tiny sector? That's the battle that's being fought right now. It's kind of a class struggle on an international scale. And the outcome of that, which is in doubt, will determine, in fact, the fate of the species.
I have just two last questions. One has to do with what has often been called the great man theory of history, that there are individuals who turn the tide of history. And often that's counterposed to the sense of movements and trends and historic factors that create change. Which side of that are you on? And is this moment a kind of complexity of both?
Well, in this moment, there's a great man who happens to be a wrecker and has tremendous power behind him. Okay, so that's unique. It's not the great man theory of history. It's the great wrecker theory of history. Sometimes that happens. But putting that aside, take a look at the people we think of as great men who achieved something. There are such people. Like take Martin Luther King. He achieved a lot. Okay, how did he do it? I suppose Martin Luther King had gotten up out of nowhere and said, "I have a dream," and so on. End of story. Martin Luther King was able to make that speech after years of work by people whose names nobody knows. I don't know. I suspect you don't know the names of the 4 Black kids who sat in at the segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and were dragged off and jailed. Others came after them. Pretty soon you had SNCC workers riding in freedom buses through the South. Northerners, some joined them, trying to get poor farmers to overcome the enormous threat of daring to vote. You had people marching in demonstrations, getting beaten and killed attacked by the vicious dogs that Trump is talking about when he says, "I'm going to send them after you." All of this went on for years, many years. Finally, it got to the point where Martin Luther King could stand up with the "I have a dream" speech. You get Lyndon Johnson putting through some legislation. So is that a great man theory of history? Well, the fact that he did it was important. Probably nobody else like him was around who could have done it. But on the back of tremendous amounts of work, same with almost anything you can think of. One of my favorite lines from my old friend, the late Howard Zinn, was that history is made by countless unknown people who lay the basis for the events that finally occur. I think pretty much that's the way it works.
You've seen a lot of history. If I'm right, I think you're in your 90s at this point. And yet you've called this the most dangerous moment. I think the most dangerous moment that you've seen.
It's the most dangerous moment in human history. We have to think what we're facing. We will overcome the pandemic at needless cost. We're not going to overcome the fact that the number of CO2 particles in the atmosphere is mounting very rapidly. That's fixed. We're not going to overcome the melting of the Arctic ice sheets. That's fixed. This goes on for another 10 or 20 years without any action on our part. We're toast. Continuing the current process, say to the end of this century, will lead, estimated, probably 7 degrees Fahrenheit or so above pre-industrial levels, which is total cataclysm. We're back to the period 125,000 years ago when the sea level was 25 feet higher than it is now. We have the answers. We know how to deal with it. We have a couple of decades to implement them. Either we do it or we don't. If we don't, the species is essentially finished. Most other species along with it. If we do it, we can have a much better society. That question has never arisen in human history, ever. And that's what we're facing now.
What does universalizing resistance then look like in this context?
Every threat that we face, there are no borders. Universalizing resistance means working together with people in other countries facing the same problems to overcome the malicious forces that are driving us to disaster. And they're deep. A lot of them are just inherent in the system of production for profit. A lot of them are inherent in that. Others are affected by the twist that was given to this by the neoliberal programs of the last 40 years, which have been disastrous and are still being implemented. For example, in the way the CARES program is being administered, that are the way regulations to mitigate the effects of climate heating are being eliminated. There's deep problems. There's immediate problems. We can deal with them. We can deal with them here, the most important country in the world, because of its power. But we're going to have to work with others everywhere. In China, in Africa, in Europe, work together on solving these problems. You don't solve them by pulling out of the COVAX consortium. You don't solve them by being the one country that right at this moment is refusing to attend the biodiversity conference of the United Nations, which is concerned with the lethal problem of the massive destruction of species from insects to mammals, which is going to devastate the world. We're out of it. Everybody else is working on it. There has to be resistance here to these lethal policies at home and cooperation with others around the world who are facing the same issues and have to work together to reverse course sharply on many fronts.
You also say, and this is my last question, that there are some internal, maybe personal challenges that we face in thinking about the relationship between self-interest and community welfare. Can you give us a hint of how you begin to think about that and whether your thoughts about that have changed in this all-important year?
It's in our individual self-interest to work with others to solve the problems that we face. As a country, we can't separate ourselves from the problems. As an individual, we can't separate ourselves. And in fact, if we want to create a better world, it's mutual. We want to stop heating the environment to the point of destruction. We work with others on how to mitigate, overcome the crisis. It's not in my self-interest to sit in a traffic jam for a couple hours to get to work. It would be in my self-interest to have efficient mass transportation, but that's a community program. And just about everything we can think of is a common endeavor of mutual support. That's what makes life worth living and leads to the goals that we hope to attain. So I don't really think we should regard this as a conflict, but rather two concerns that are mutually supportive.
So your last message to those perhaps white voters who believe what Trump has told them, that their self-interest is to keep as much stuff as possible for themselves and keep a lot of other people out, preferably out of the country or out of the workplace, they're just flat out wrong?
Totally wrong. I mean, my parents were immigrants. Go back far enough, yours were. That's the way the country is built. Not in a pretty way. It included extermination of the indigenous population. Like right now, I happen to be sitting on what were the lands of the Tohono O'odham tribe. Can't really compensate, but do what we can to overcome to that terrible atrocity, bring them back into, they're on reservations not far from here. So yes, we're in it together. I'm not far from the Mexican border where people are dying in the desert under horrifying attack from the tactical forces of the Border Patrol, dying in the desert because they're fleeing from our destruction of their countries, not because they want to be here, because their countries are unlivable, largely because of what we did to them in the very recent past and are continuing to do to them. So yes, we're in it together. Let's work on it together. Let's make it possible for them to live at home where they want to be instead of destroying their homes so they have to die in the desert south of Tucson.
Beautiful. Thank you. Wonderful to see you again.
Good to talk to you.
That was Noam Chomsky, social critic and MIT professor emeritus. His forthcoming book, one of many, is Chomsky for Activists, Universalizing Resistance. For information on that and more information on this episode, including all the research notes and how to watch our pre- and post-election special TV programs, go to patreon.com/DLF show and become a regular subscriber. You can sign up for just $3 a month. Nowadays, independent media is more important than ever. So please support us by becoming a Patreon partner. And if you're already a partner, thank you. I'll give you a monthly contribution just a bit. You can do all of that at patreon.com/DLF show. That's patreon.com/DLF show. And we do appreciate you. Thank you. And thanks for listening. Till the next time, stay kind, stay curious, and move. This show is produced by